At the age of 89, Jerry Kramer is remembered by America as the immortal symbol of the Green Bay Packers, one of the greatest pillars of the Vince Lombardi era. The man who helped redefine modern football. He was the heart of the Packers sweep, the revolutionary play that carried the Packers to 5 NFL championships and the first 2 Super Bowls. His historic block in the 1967 Ice Bowl that opened a hole just wide enough for Bart Starr to sneak through has become a sacred moment in NFL lore, regarded as the most famous block in football history. He was a 5-time All-Pro, a true champion, and more importantly, the man who opened the door for millions of Americans to understand that football is not just a sport, it is a battle of will. His book Instant Replay became one of the most beloved sports memoirs of all time, the first to take American readers inside the blood, sweat, and darkness behind victory. Jerry's achievements go beyond titles. They live in the deep cultural impact he left, a legacy of a trench warrior who changed how America views the sacrifice of guards, the men so often forgotten in the spotlight. Yet behind all that glory lies a lifetime of pain. His body was crushed by 23 surgeries, by brutal winters at Lambeau Field, by collisions that still make his bones scream every morning. His friends, the men he fought beside, have left one by one, leaving Jerry as the last survivor of his generation. But the greatest pain of all has been being forgotten, rejected by the Hall of Fame more than 10 times, forced to watch teammates honored while his own name was left in silence. And it is in that very pain that his spirit shines brightest, an unbreakable will, a heart that still beats strong even when time tries to break it, an old warrior who still stands tall to prove that a true legacy never dies. If you want to continue the painful yet extraordinary journey of the legend Jerry Kramer, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part. At 89, when his steps have grown heavy and memories start slipping away like thin ice melting on a spring lake, Jerry Kramer still can't forget where it all began. Montana and then Idaho, 2 wild, freezing, impoverished places where weakness was never allowed, not even for a second. Endless ranches under gray skies, winters that arrived without warning, wind that whipped the face like a leather strap. For most kids, childhood meant smiles and safety. For Jerry, childhood was the first lesson in survival. His parents loved their children, but it wasn't soft or gentle love. They were children of the Great Depression, people who knew life was always ready to crush anyone who showed weakness. So their love for Jerry came wrapped in discipline, in demands to get up yourself, handle it yourself, don't complain. From a very young age, Jerry understood that if he wanted to survive, he had to forge himself in the harshness around him. In Idaho, little Jerry worked the ranch before he even reached his father's shoulder, shoveling grain, dragging calves, cleaning troughs, splitting wood, tiny hands blistered and cracked through endless winters. But the cruelest thing of all was the loneliness. In the vast wilderness, Jerry often felt like a speck of dust lost in a blizzard. No one praised him, no one patted him on the back, no one told him he was good enough. In a family of 8 kids, he blended into the chaos of chores, harvests, and exhaustion. Then, at age 15, his life nearly ended in an accident he would later call fate's first warning. That day he was chasing a panicked calf. In the chaos, the animal kicked a large wooden plank loose. The board shattered into razor-sharp pieces, and one long shard drove straight into Jerry's stomach, tearing through muscle and stopping just short of his spine. The pain hit like lightning. He couldn't breathe. His legs buckled, his vision blurred, blood soaked his old shirt. Out on that remote ranch there were no sirens, no doctors, just cold despair, and a boy's breath slipping away. Adults threw him into a pickup truck and raced over dirt roads covered in dust and snow. Half conscious, he felt every bounce drive the wood deeper. At the hospital, doctors had to saw the plank in half. One piece pulled out the front, the other from his back. One wrong angle, and he'd have been paralyzed. 1 minute slower, and he'd have died on the way. But Jerry survived. He opened his eyes in a hospital bed, shaking with pain, but alive. And in that moment a strange seed was planted in his soul, the iron will of someone who had stared death in the face and felt its cold breath on his skin. He understood that life would never be gentle with him, and if he wanted to escape the invisibility of his childhood, to rise above those frozen fields, he had to become stronger than everything the wilderness had thrown at him. But along with that will, a shadow also took root, the fear of being left behind, the fear of never being good enough, the fear that life could take everything away at any moment. And from Montana and Idaho, from blood, sweat, and tears no one ever saw, a warrior began to form, not through glory, but through pain. No one noticed, no one praised him, but a power was rising inside the boy Jerry Kramer, a power that would carry him to the NFL, to history, and that would also make him pay with the rest of his life. And then, just as the wound from the accident at 15 began to close, Jerry entered the years he would later call the time I was nobody. If the ranch in Idaho taught him nature's cruelty, school taught him human cruelty, something not as cold as a Montana wind, but sharp enough to cut straight to the soul. At school, Jerry wasn't a star. He wasn't a standout student. He wasn't the kid teachers pinned their hopes on. He wasn't even the troublemaker anyone remembered. No, he occupied a worse place, invisible. The blond kid with broad shoulders who always sat in the back. No one recruited him for sports. No one noticed him in class. Even when he was there, Jerry might as well not have existed. He walked the halls like a ghost. He came to class and left without anyone noticing. On the ranch he had at least been a pair of working hands. At school he wasn't even someone. No one believed he would ever amount to anything. And that invisibility, that being overlooked, planted a different kind of pain, one without scars or blood, but a slow burn that gnawed at his soul for years. But what hurt Jerry most wasn't that others didn't believe in him. What nearly broke him was that he started not believing in himself. The feeling of never being good enough, never worth remembering, never measuring up soaked into him like thick frost over an Idaho winter. In his first high school football games, he wasn't a standout either. He had size but no polish, fast but not fast enough, strong but not the strongest. Coaches saw him as a permanent backup, the kind of player you keep out of courtesy, not expectation. And Jerry knew it. Standing on the sideline, he heard the studs of the starters' cleats pounding the turf like the heartbeat of a world he didn't belong to. He looked at the scoreboard, at the stands, and felt like a shadow, someone standing outside life as it happened. No one told him he had potential. No one praised him, pushed him, or said he belonged on that field. His classmates, they saw him as the most forgettable kid in class. No one invited him to parties. No one asked him to hang out. He joined sports just to exist somewhere in the group, but the spot he got was the one no one fought for, bench warmer. And that made him feel more humiliated than any loss. There's a kind of shame that doesn't come from being laughed at. It comes from absolute indifference. Jerry lived it every day. He went to school in silence, sat in class in silence, went home in silence. And in that silence the biggest question took shape. Will my life ever be anything more than this Idaho? As a teenager, he looked at the horizon and saw nothing but snow-covered mountains, vast, beautiful but trapping him in repetition. In Idaho, dreaming of going pro sounded as crazy as saying you were going to the moon. His life felt like the ranch he grew up on, hard, cold, and without a single door to walk through. But in those years of being dismissed the most, something quiet happened. Every time someone didn't believe in him, he swallowed that humiliation and let it flow into his blood like a silent vow. No one believes in me. Fine. No one thinks I'm good enough. Fine. No one expects anything from me. Fine. But one day Jerry promised himself he would prove them all wrong. It wasn't the vow of a confident kid. It was the cry of someone who had been overlooked for too long. A small, weak voice, but stubborn, like an ember in a winter fireplace, just waiting for enough air to roar into flame. And then football came, not as a savior, just as a thin rope for Jerry to grab, to see if the world would ever accept him even once. But he didn't yet know that rope would drag him through the greatest victories, and hurl him into the deepest pains of a man's life. As his high school years passed, like a string of silent days, Jerry entered the University of Idaho, hoping to escape the shadow of invisibility, and, maybe for the first time in his life, saw a door crack open. But, as with everything in his life, that door didn't lead straight to light. It opened onto a harder, more painful path, the very one that would forge him into the man America would later revere. The University of Idaho in the 1950s wasn't glamorous. It was a school for rough farm boys, where football wasn't just a game, it was the only lifeline many poor kids had to a dream. Jerry was one of them. He arrived not with the confidence of a natural talent, but with the weight of years of being dismissed still on his shoulders. He came to find out if an invisible kid could ever become somebody, and the harsh truth hit fast. Jerry wasn't exceptional, not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most skilled, not the first guy the coach looked at when building a line. He had size but raw movement and green technique. Some days he thought he had only traded one Idaho shadow for a bigger one. But what set Jerry apart wasn't talent. It was the gift the darkness had quietly given him, a refusal to quit. Even when Idaho didn't welcome him with open arms, Jerry attacked practice like he was fighting for his life. And he literally was. Every practice with the Idaho Vandals was a war. His freshman year he suffered worse injuries than all of high school combined. One hit tore his knee ligaments, one fall broke fingers, one bad angle collision ripped his shoulder muscle and kept his arm useless for nearly 2 weeks. College doctors back then didn't have today's technology. Treatment was tape, ice, and the advice, if you can stand the pain, get back out there. And Jerry got back out there. Every time. And that kept happening until the coaches started to notice. They didn't see perfect technique. They didn't see blazing speed. They saw a young man who could take pain that made others quit. A young man who fell and got up even when getting up meant more pain. One freezing Idaho afternoon, after a practice so brutal his breath froze in the air, his coach watched him for a long time, then said something Jerry never forgot: "You've got the heart of a giant, but you'll never be strong enough." It wasn't encouragement, it was a verdict, and it cut deeper than any physical wound. Jerry didn't answer, he just nodded, then went back to doing push-ups, while everyone else headed to the showers. But that sentence became a mental scar that never healed, echoing for years that he was never strong enough. A sentence fate would later force him to prove wrong with blood. One night in his cramped dorm room, Jerry sat staring at bruised hands and swollen knuckles from blocking too much. Everyone around him slept. He stayed awake in the dark, asking himself if after all this pain he would ever escape the Idaho cycle: poverty, invisibility, being dismissed. But that was also the night Jerry made a silent decision no one heard. No matter what injuries take, no matter what the coach says, no matter if my body betrays me, I will never quit. Never. From then on he was the first to the field and the last to leave. He did extra drills after practice ended. He lifted while others ate dinner. He ran hills alone at 11 p.m. in the snow, and in the darkness of Idaho that quiet belief grew: if the world won't open the door for me, I'll break it down. But fate never gives anything without taking something else. For Jerry, every choice to rise came at a painful price, and that pain was only beginning. Because the road from the University of Idaho to the NFL would still be soaked in blood, tears, and hits that made him think more than once his life would end before he ever made history. But from that lonely place, from being the kid who was never strong enough, a warrior was quietly forming, a warrior America would one day call a legend. When his final college season ended, Jerry knew he stood at the biggest crossroads of his life. Either the NFL opened a door, or all those years of enduring pain would only lead back to Idaho as if nothing had ever happened. But in the 1950s, guards weren't the positions teams chased. Teams drafted quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, the highlight makers. Guys like Jerry, rough hands, nameless blocks were seen as nice to have, but you can live without. Yet in the 1958 NFL Draft, the Green Bay Packers called Jerry Kramer's name in the 4th round. No fanfare, no excitement, no cameras on his face, no championships predicted, just a quick announcement in a meeting room. Many local reporters didn't even know who he was. In Idaho, Jerry learned the news from a tiny line in the newspaper: no celebration party, no TV calls, just silence in a cramped dorm room, and a few teammates slapping him on the back. But to him, those words were a streak of light through the darkness. He thought that was when the dream began. He didn't yet understand reality would be crueler than all his Idaho years combined. When Jerry arrived in Green Bay, He realized instantly the NFL wasn't college continued. It was a different universe. The Packers were then the worst team in the league. Disorganized, sloppy practices, players with no spirit. In that mess, rookies like Jerry were perfect targets to take frustrations out on. His first day in a Packers uniform, he was screamed at until his face burned. In his first practice, he got driven backward like he'd never played football. Coaches looked at him like damaged goods. Teammates saw him as dead weight. In college, he had only been not good enough. In the NFL, he was treated like a mistake. One afternoon, after a failed block ruined a play, the coach slammed his clipboard down and screamed in front of the whole team, "Kramer, if you play like that tomorrow, don't bother showing up." The field went dead silent. Jerry stood there breathing hard in heavy pads, sweat mixing with dirt, heart crushed. Laughter from the sideline cut his pride like knives. The invisible childhood came rushing back. The never strong enough from Idaho roared back to life. The years of being dismissed dragged him down into the familiar pit. That night Jerry sat alone under a dim lamp, hands still shaking. He asked himself, "Do I really belong here? Am I just repeating my whole life? Nobody in Montana, nobody in Idaho, and now nobody in Green Bay." That night he called home. His voice broke. "I don't know if I'm good enough." But his father, the hard, quiet man, said only one thing: "You don't walk away from something just because it's hard. You survived Montana. You survived a plank through your gut. You survived Idaho. You'll survive the NFL." It didn't make the pain smaller, but it reminded Jerry his life had never been easy. It had never opened doors for him, so why should the NFL? The next day Jerry showed up with red eyes from no sleep. He wasn't a genius. He wasn't a star. He wasn't a high pick. But he was the guy who didn't know how to quit. While other rookies trembled every time they got yelled at, Jerry stood still, took it, persisted, absorbed every insult the same way he once absorbed endless Idaho winters. But no one knew that in those first weeks, Jerry came within a hair of being cut by the Packers twice. An internal evaluation read, "Not strong enough, not fast enough, may not belong in the NFL." One more bad practice and his dream would have ended as quietly as it began. But fate has never stood with Jerry from the start. It only stands with those who fight to their last breath. And Jerry, as always, chose to fight. He didn't yet know he wouldn't just survive. He would become one of the greatest warriors the NFL has ever seen. But before that happened, life would throw many more punches, punches so painful that Idaho and draft day would feel like nothing more than the first light breezes of the season. While Jerry was still fighting just to keep his spot on the Packers, fate walked onto the practice field in the form of a man in a dark suit, thick glasses, and eyes sharp enough to make the biggest NFL warriors look down. The day Vince Lombardi arrived in Green Bay, the entire team practically shook before his presence. And Jerry, he had no idea his life was about to change forever, in the most painful, brutal yet glorious way a human being can experience. Lombardi wasn't just a coach. He was a storm, a mirror, military discipline in the body of a preacher. On day one he looked Jerry dead in the eye, and said something he would never forget: "I don't care how strong you are, I care how much you can take." That wasn't praise. That was a warning. From that moment on, every practice became pure torture. No more grimacing from pain. No more staying down after a fall. Lombardi wanted to see Jerry get up even when his bones were screaming. He wanted to know if this young guard could become part of the most ruthless philosophy in NFL history, a philosophy that boiled down to 3 words: never good enough. When Jerry's block wasn't hard enough, Lombardi roared right in his face, voice cracking like a gunshot. "Again, harder. You think that's enough? Nobody here is enough." When Jerry started to fade, Lombardi didn't ease up. He turned it up. "You tired? Good, now we start." When Jerry staggered from pain, Lombardi stared straight into his eyes. "If you think life is fair, you're in the wrong sport." But inside all that yelling was a truth Jerry hadn't yet seen. Lombardi was seeing something Jerry himself had long forgotten: his own potential. In those first months under Lombardi, Jerry thought he would break 100 times. Morning practices left him throwing up. Afternoon sessions left his shoulders numb. Every night he soaked his feet in ice, iced his back with cold towels, and swallowed pain like it was part of who he was. Yet in the middle of all that agony, something strange happened. Jerry got stronger, not just muscle, though his body did grow into a war machine, but the strength inside. The shame from Idaho, the never strong enough taunts, the near cuts from the roster, everything slowly turned into fuel. Lombardi had accidentally dug up the pieces of confidence buried deep inside him, and out of that brutality, a new Jerry was born. The Packers lived by a Lombardi mantra he repeated constantly: forget the glamour of touchdowns. This empire is built by the men in the trenches, and of all the men in those trenches, no one embodied Lombardi's spirit more than Jerry Kramer. On the practice field, Lombardi made Jerry block the same sled over and over, until his arms went dead. Hundreds of times a day, thousands of times a month. One wrong step, one bad angle, and he started over. Lombardi stood right behind him, missing nothing. Lower, faster, more precise. You're either perfect or you're off my field. Every scream was a hammer blow forging Jerry's soul. Every fall was a lesson in survival. Every step was a deal struck with pain. Through those years, Jerry was injured constantly. Torn shoulders, twisted ankles, cracked ribs, and worst of all, the old abdominal area where the wood had gone through, now constantly stretched and hammered by collisions with opposing defensive lines. Some days he left the field feeling like his insides had been turned inside out, but he never quit. Not while Lombardi saw him as a piece of the machine he was building. And then, out of those seemingly endless practices, the Packers sweep was born, a play that would change NFL history forever. In the Packers sweep, Jerry's position wasn't just important, it was the heart. He had to turn, pull, lead to the edge, and blow open lanes for the running back. Without him the play didn't work. Without him the Packers couldn't run their most dangerous weapon. Here Lombardi stopped yelling. He just said one thing: Kramer, you're the first man I count on. That was the first time in his life Jerry heard someone say they counted on him, and it was so sacred he carried that feeling for the next 60 years. But every success under Lombardi came at the price of blood. Every time Jerry pulled on the sweep he faced bigger, meaner defensive ends. He blocked with his whole body, with the stomach that had once been torn open, with shoulders that had been dislocated, with arms that had been broken. Some mornings he had to push himself out of bed with both hands, because his back wouldn't let him sit up. Some nights he lay frozen, unable to roll over because the muscles burned like fire. Yet he never quit, because Lombardi wouldn't allow it. And more importantly, because Jerry refused to be invisible ever again. Slowly Lombardi stopped yelling at Jerry so much. He just nodded. A rare quick nod, but one that carried all the recognition Jerry had craved since he was the forgotten boy in Idaho. Jerry didn't just become a guard, he became Lombardi's guard, the symbol of the Packers' spirit, a warrior who didn't know how to fall, a man forged from steel and pain, the heart of an entire empire. But the price of being the heart is simple: it has to take the most punishment, hurt the most and break first. And fate still had deeper wounds, harsher surgeries, and crueler battles in store for Jerry, because to become a legend, he had to walk through hell one more time. After the years Lombardi hammered Jerry into the Packers' steel-headed warrior, fate showed him no mercy. Instead, it opened a completely different chapter. Not one of victories, but of pain, blood, sterile operating rooms, and moments when he stood between life and death. If the Packers' sweep was Jerry's epic on the field, the 23 surgeries were his epic in the dark, where there were no roaring crowds, only beeping monitors and the cold smell of antiseptic. And the cruelest part? So much of that pain traced back to the piece of wood that had gone through his stomach at age 15. Something he thought he'd left behind in Idaho. Years later, in his memoir, Jerry admitted, "I didn't know fate had saved that debt of pain for me." It wasn't just a physical wound, it was a curse that followed him through his entire NFL career. In the middle of those blazing championship seasons, when the Packers were at the peak of their power, Jerry started feeling a dull ache in his stomach. At first it was like a needle prick when he turned, then a burning spread every time he delivered a block. But Jerry, the kid dismissed in Idaho, the college player told he'd never be strong enough, the warrior sharpened by Lombardi's iron discipline, never allowed himself to admit pain. He just clenched his teeth and kept fighting. Until one day, after a game ended, Jerry walked into the locker room and collapsed. The pain twisted like a knife inside his gut. He couldn't stand straight, couldn't breathe normally. Teammates rushed him to the hospital, and there the doctors discovered what Jerry never expected. The scar tissue from the accident at 15 had become severely infected. It had spread through his abdomen and was causing serious internal damage. If they didn't operate immediately, he could die within days. The first surgery lasted hours. Doctors cut away dead tissue, cleaned the infection, and tried to patch what had been eaten away from the inside. But the terrifying part was this: the old wood wound never stayed quiet. It had been battered for years by football, by hundreds of collisions, and every hit was an invisible knife. Jerry woke up with a long incision across his stomach. He was gaunt, eyes sunken, looking like a man who had just crawled off a battlefield. His body shook with pain, but what terrified him wasn't the pain. It was the stabbing question in his mind: will I ever get back on the field? He had fought for every breath in Idaho, fought to stand tall in college, fought to survive Lombardi. He had battled so the NFL would finally see him, and now fate wanted to take it all away. But his journey of pain was far from over. The second surgery came just months later. The abdomen became infected again. His body responded weakly. Jerry lost so much weight the pads hung loose on him. Legs that once powered him now trembled when he walked. The Packers' coaches, teammates and medical staff all thought he should retire. Doctors even warned that if he kept playing, he could rupture his abdomen, or worse, die on the field. But Lombardi walked into the hospital room, stood by the bed, eyes like steel, not to force him, not to yell, and not to comfort. He simply said, "Kramer, we need you." And to Jerry, those 4 words were stronger than any painkiller, stronger than any doctor's orders. He looked into the eyes of the man who had forged him from ashes, and he knew that if he didn't get up, his life would slide back into the invisibility he had fought so bitterly to escape. Still not fully healed, stomach still feeling like it was being torn open, every step dragging his insides with it, Jerry returned to practice. It was one of the bravest and most reckless decisions any player has ever made. Over the course of his career, Jerry Kramer went through a total of 23 surgeries, not 23 stitches, not 23 ice packs, 23 times waking up to the smell of anesthesia, 23 times staring into operating room lights, 23 times hearing doctors say things most people only hear once in a lifetime. We did everything we could. The injury is very complicated. You'll be out a long time if you keep playing. In some of those surgeries, doctors opened his abdomen and found scar tissue fused in sheets to his intestines. Sometimes they had to remove sections of damaged bowel. Sometimes they drained pockets of infection. Sometimes they stitched a stomach wall that, if it tore just a little more, would mean he'd never get up again. But every single time he came back. When he ran, it felt like his gut was being pulled downward. When he turned, the incision burned like hot coals. When he blocked, every collision felt like an invisible blade slicing wounds that never had time to heal. There is no story in the NFL more painful than that. No one played with the level of damage Jerry endured. He didn't just play football, he played with death walking beside him, game after game, season after season. And no one knew except him, the doctors and Lombardi. Yet in the middle of all that blood and scalpels, something astonishing happened. Jerry didn't die, he didn't quit, he wasn't buried by the pain. On the contrary, the deeper the wounds, the sharper his will became, the worse his stomach hurt, the stronger his heart grew. His insides were nearly destroyed, but his spirit never broke. And from the hell of those 23 surgeries, Jerry Kramer walked into a moment that would change NFL history forever. A moment the entire country would forever call by one name, the Ice Bowl. But to get to that day, he had to keep living, keep enduring, keep fighting, even when his body wanted to give up long before his mind did. The surgeries didn't stop, the pain didn't stop, and the greatest battle of Jerry's life was still ahead. 6 days after Christmas 1967, the Wisconsin sky turned the color of ash under a cold storm, unlike anything in human memory. All of Green Bay was frozen solid, roads covered in thick ice, Little houses huddled against the bitterness. And then on December 31st, the cold stopped being weather. It became a hunter of men. Wind chill, 45 degrees Fahrenheit. No mistake, minus 45 degrees. A number even lifelong northern Wisconsinites couldn't imagine on their skin. Breath froze the instant it left your mouth. Tears in players' eyes turned to ice crystals. Gloves stiffened after minutes on the field. And in the middle of that white hell, a game was still played. A game that would carve its name into history, with a title that still makes people shiver, the Ice Bowl. For Jerry Kramer, the game started before he ever stepped on the field. The night before the Ice Bowl, the old abdominal pain, from scars that had never fully healed, came roaring back, like someone was ripping him open from the inside with iron hooks. He woke up over and over, doubled over, cold sweat running down his back, even though the temperature outside could freeze blood. But he told no doctor, he told no Lombardi, he told no one. He knew the Packers needed him. He knew Bart Starr would never succeed without him opening the hole. And he knew, as he had known since he was that Idaho boy, that pain was simply part of his life. When he walked onto Lambeau Field, the cold hit like 1,000 knives against his skin. The turf was one giant sheet of ice. Every step threatened to send him sprawling. His breath froze into white clouds right in front of his face. Fingertips went numb instantly. But what hurt worse than the cold was the twisting agony in his gut. Every time he got into his blocking stance, it felt like the wound was being torn in half. Yet Jerry never backed off. The game was suffocatingly tense. The Cowboys were stronger, younger, fresher. The Packers moved sluggishly in the cold, breathing hard, collisions ringing out like wood on wood. Players slipped constantly, the football hard as rock. Every time Jerry fired out into an opposing defensive tackle, it felt like someone was punching him in the guts from the inside. He clenched his teeth so hard he never let a scream escape. Late in the fourth quarter, Dallas led. America was starting to believe the Packers, Lombardi's Packers, were about to fall to the harshest conditions in NFL history. But on the sideline, Lombardi looked at Jerry. He said nothing, just looked. And in that look was every practice, every scream, every night Jerry had risen from the darkness. No words were needed. Jerry understood. This is my moment. With 16 seconds left, the Packers were at the Dallas goal line. No timeouts left. No time for anything fancy. Fail and the game ends. Succeed and they step into immortality. Bart Starr jogged to the huddle, voice shaking not from fear but from lips nearly frozen stiff. 31 wedge. On 2. Jerry looked at Starr. Starr looked back. They both knew this play would live or die entirely on Jerry Kramer. The Packers' sweep might be Green Bay's masterpiece, but there was no time for a long developing run now. This was the simplest, bravest play of all quarterback sneak, with Jerry opening the path. They lined up. Jerry faced defensive tackle Jethro Pugh, younger, stronger, not someone who'd had his stomach cut open 10 times in a year. The wind cut like knives across his face. His lungs felt frozen solid, and the pain from the old incisions exploded so violently he nearly dropped to his knees. But when the ball snapped, in that instant, Jerry was no longer the scarred-up 31-year-old man. He was the Idaho kid who survived a plank through his gut, the invisible boy mocked at school, the rookie the Packers almost cut, the man Lombardi had forged in fire and pain. Jerry fired forward, with everything he had left. He threw his entire body, every unhealed wound, every twist of agony into that final block. Hips turned, shoulder dipped low, cleats dug hard into the slick ice. Time slowed. His shoulder met Pugh's chest. A faint crack echoed from somewhere deep inside Jerry's own abdomen, like the old scar ripping open. He didn't stop. He drove. He drove with his soul. Pugh went backward. At that exact second, Starr dove through the hole Jerry had created. Lambeau Field erupted. No one felt that historic moment more than Jerry, because he paid for it with his own body. When the referee threw his arms up for the touchdown, Jerry didn't jump. He didn't scream. He didn't hug anyone. He collapsed to his knees, arms wrapped around his stomach, gasping in broken breaths from the pain. Victory bought with his health. But America never knew. Reporters called him a hero. Packers fans called him the heart of the Ice Bowl. Lombardi simply put a hand on his shoulder. "Good job, Jerry." That was all. But for Jerry, it was enough to turn agony into light. Years later, when asked about the Ice Bowl, Jerry didn't talk about the win. He didn't talk about glory. He talked about the 45 degrees Fahrenheit cold, and the feeling that his stomach was being torn in half. He talked about the moment he saw a star cross through the hole he'd opened, and understood that every ounce of pain in his life, from Idaho to the operating table, had led to that single second. He talked about the price no one saw. After the game he vomited from the pain, couldn't sleep for nights, and had to go under the knife again. But if he had it to do over, he would still make that block. He would still drive Pugh back. He would still open the path. Because that's who Jerry Kramer is, a man willing to trade his health, his career, even his life, just so his team could win. And the Ice Bowl, the coldest game in history, sealed him into legend forever. But behind that victory, another hell was waiting. Because Jerry's life story isn't only ice, it's also forgetting, it's loneliness, and 40 years waiting for justice that never came on time. The Ice Bowl victory made Jerry Kramer a legend, but what no one says is the higher you climb, the harder you fall. And for Jerry, that fall began the moment his body started betraying him, quietly, slowly, but more cruelly than any defensive tackle he ever faced. His final NFL seasons were the last steps of a warrior bleeding out yet still holding the flag. His stomach hurt every time he turned. His left shoulder burned when he raised his arm. His knees swelled after every game until his shoes felt like they were crushing bone. Every morning Jerry needed minutes just to stand up. It felt like those Idaho childhood mornings in the snow, except this time it wasn't the weather, it was his own body. The Packers kept winning. Lombardi kept leading the team to dazzling triumphs, but time spares no one, not even the immortals. Lombardi left the Packers. Jerry's teammates retired one by one. The locker room that once shook with laughter, shouting and helmets clanging together, became only a memory. Jerry's steps grew heavy. Every game, every hit, he felt himself aging faster than everyone else. And then came the day every player dreads, the day the heart still wants to fight, but the body no longer obeys. Jerry retired. No grand farewell, no massive ceremony, no goodbye song or fireworks. Just a short newspaper notice, and an off-season Jerry knew he would never return from. The morning after he made the decision, Jerry sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, staring at the hands that once opened lanes for Bart Starr, that once drove back Jethro Pugh, that once shielded the Packers from the NFL's hardest hits. Now those hands shook from pain. For the first time in years, Jerry lived a Sunday morning without pads, without the stadium, without the whistle blowing. But that silence wasn't peace, it was emptiness. He stepped out onto the porch. The familiar Idaho wind slapped his face, but instead of feeling welcomed like when he was a boy, it chilled him to the bone. Jerry stood still, eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Who am I when football is gone? That question wasn't just confusion, it was loss. Football wasn't just Jerry's job, it was his identity, the one thing that gave meaning to the invisible years of his childhood. No more practices, no more games, no more Lombardi screaming in his face every morning, no more teammates slapping him on the back after victories, no more 70,000 voices at Lambeau Field chanting his name, only a vast emptiness that swallowed the spirit of the strongest man anyone knew. But the NFL doesn't stop for anyone. Just months after he retired, new faces appeared, younger, faster, stronger guards. Their names were in the papers, on television, and when the Packers scored a new touchdown, no one mentioned the man who created the Packers sweep anymore. In an interview years later, Jerry admitted, "The worst pain wasn't that I couldn't play anymore. The worst pain was that the NFL no longer needed me." He felt left behind, as if his entire career, the injuries, the surgeries, the near-death moments now existed only in his own memory. No one else remembered, no one else mentioned it. And then the real loneliness began. Jerry started living with chronic pain. His spine stiffened, His right shoulder went numb regularly. His knees swelled so badly he needed hot towels every night. Some days he lay on the sofa all morning, just waiting for his body to allow him to stand. The abdominal muscles that had been cut open over and over hurt like a knife every time he bent over. Doctors told him his body was that of a 70-year-old man at age 35. But the deepest pain wasn't physical. It was in his soul. A man who had spent his whole life fighting not to be invisible was sliding back into the dark. He tried writing a book, and Instant Replay became a historic hit. But even though the book brought Jerry back into the light, the cruel truth remained: the NFL never honored him. The Hall of Fame passed him over. The voters looked at his resume, and even though he was the heart of the sweep, they still said not enough. Those two familiar words, not enough, stabbed him again. Just like Idaho, just like college, just like his first days under Lombardi, Jerry realized darkness has a way of returning to those who fought their whole lives to escape it. For years he was nominated for the Hall of Fame and not selected. Every rejection twisted his heart the same way Lombardi's screams once did on the practice field. But this time was different. There was no game to prove himself in, no practice to fix mistakes, no chance to turn it around, only silence. And then he began to feel small again in a world he had once helped shape. He looked at the pages that recorded his runs. He watched the Ice Bowl film. He stared at photos of Lombardi, and he asked himself, did all that pain even matter? For many years after retirement, Jerry lived in limbo, no longer a player but not yet sure who he was outside the NFL. He went to old Packers reunions. He sat with aging teammates, watched them laugh, watched their hands shake lifting a beer. But behind those smiles was the truth. Everyone hurt, everyone was broken, everyone had been left behind by the NFL, and Jerry hurt more than all of them. But fate wouldn't let him stay in the dark forever. One day he didn't know when justice would knock. But before that happened, he had to live through the longest, loneliest, most painful years of his life. The time when a warrior no longer had a battlefield, and the question, who am I when football is gone, would haunt him for decades to come. But in those empty post-retirement years, when his body ached every morning, when the NFL marched on without looking back, when the Hall of Fame kept slamming the door in his face, one thought began to form in Jerry: if I disappear, who will remember who I was? That question wasn't pride. It was the primal fear of a man who had been dismissed since childhood, invisible all through his early years, told by his college coach he would never be strong enough, almost cut by the Packers. A man who had spent his entire life fighting to be seen, now facing the possibility that history might bury him again. And then from that darkness, a decision was born: Jerry would write his own life, not to brag about victories, but to fight the forgetting that was quietly swallowing him whole. That's how Instant Replay came to be. At first the book was just a small diary Jerry kept every night after practice or games. He wrote about the pain in his body, the sleepless nights, Lombardi's screaming, the moments he felt he wasn't good enough. He wrote in the voice of a man who refused to lose even one memory that had made him who he was. James McInner once said, "History will forget those who do not write it themselves." Jerry understood that in his own way, with bone and blood. Instant Replay wasn't just words, it was the life raft he clung to for meaning. When he met reporter Dick Shape looked at the sweat-stained scribbled pages and said, "Jerry, this isn't just a book, this is the heart of the NFL." And together they turned those pages into a work that shook America. The book was written like the raw confession of a trench warrior: no glamour, no polish. It laid bare truths fans had never known. The NFL isn't stadium lights. It's pain, it's fear, it's sacrifice, it's waiting for a surgeon's knife, it's mornings when you can't get out of bed. When Instant Replay came out in 1968, it instantly became a phenomenon. It sold more copies than any publisher ever dreamed. Fans read it cover to cover in one night. Reporters called it the book that changed how America sees football. But for Jerry, that success carried two opposite feelings. On one hand, he was happy that people finally saw the pain behind the victories, happy that the voice of a guard, the most overlooked position in the NFL, was finally heard, happy that he was no longer invisible. On the other hand, He hurt in a way no reader could ever feel, because no matter how big a bestseller it became, no matter how much America loved it, the Hall of Fame still never called his name. The voters read Instant Replay, praised his writing, then voted for someone else. Jerry's pain wasn't eased, it was amplified. It felt like screaming on the frozen field of the ice bowl, full of blood and cold and no one hearing. In the years that followed, Jerry came to understand that Instant Replay wasn't just a book about football, it was the plea of a man terrified of being forgotten, terrified that everything he had traded 23 surgeries, nights when stomach pain nearly killed him, the legendary block in 45 degrees Fahrenheit, would vanish into the haze of history, afraid that the pain tormenting him every single day meant nothing to anyone but himself, afraid that a warrior's lifetime would be reduced to one line, guard for the Packers, and so Instant Replay became Jerry's last way to hold on to his past. It was how he told the world, "I was there, I felt it, I fought, and I deserve to be remembered." But writing down memories doesn't equal justice. Jerry was still ignored by the Hall. Voters said he didn't have enough impact. Newer players went into the Hall of Fame while Jerry, author of the book considered the football Bible, stood outside the door for decades. The longer time passed, the more famous the book became, and the more the man who wrote it was forgotten. That was the real tragedy. If he could no longer play football, Jerry could endure it. If he was no longer healthy, he could endure it. But if he was not remembered, if his sacrifice was never acknowledged, that was what hurt him the most. Instant Replay was the voice he left for the world, but at the same time, it was the cry for help of a warrior who felt himself being slowly buried by time, inch by inch. He didn't know it would take more than 40 years for justice to knock. But before that light finally came, the darkness kept covering him for decades, thicker, colder, and lonelier. And in that darkness, Jerry Kramer kept waiting, waiting to be seen, waiting to be recognized, waiting to hear his name called. But the darkness Jerry faced didn't just come from the Hall of Fame, from his injuries, or from the NFL's forgetting. It also came from the place that hurt him the deepest, his family. If football was where he found strength, family was where he faced the fragility of a man's heart, a man who only knew how to fight, but was never taught how to love. A brilliant career, fame, glory, none of it helped Jerry hold a marriage together. He married for the first time while still playing for the Packers, during years when the practice and game schedule was so brutal, he barely had time to breathe. His wife tried, but how can a marriage survive when every weekend is a game and he's gone 200 days a year? And most importantly, how do you stay married to a man whose emotions are locked behind invisible armor? The NFL taught Jerry how to endure. Lombardi taught him never to be weak. Childhood taught him to get up without crying. But no one taught Jerry how to listen, how to hold the person he loved when they were hurting, how to say "I need you." Things that seemed simple were the hardest lessons for Jerry. His first marriage fell apart, not because of betrayal, not because of anyone's fault, but because Jerry couldn't take off the warrior version of himself, even when he walked through the door. He loved in silence, loved by being present without words, loved through actions, never spoken, and sometimes silence can wound. His second marriage followed the same path. Jerry tried harder, but illness and the aftermath of 23 surgeries left him exhausted. Sudden pain made him irritable. Walking was hard, sleeping was hard, his mood grew darker. How can a man fighting the collapse of his own body also fight for a marriage? And so once again, Jerry watched the woman he loved walk out of his life. 2 marriages, 2 failures, 2 times watching family life shatter like glass he couldn't put back together. But the tragedy cut even deeper when he became a father, because love for his children brought a different fear, the fear that they would grow up seeing him not as a hero, but as a broken, crippled man who couldn't pick them up because of shoulder pain, who couldn't run with them because his knees gave out. Jerry once confessed, "I'm not afraid of pain, I'm afraid that one day I won't be able to be a full father." That was the truest confession about who he was, a warrior who could block Jethro Pugh in 45 degrees Fahrenheit, but was terrified he couldn't change a light bulb when his kid needed it. He feared becoming a burden, feared that his heroic NFL scars would be the reason he couldn't be a real dad. There were nights he lay in the dark, listening to his own heartbeat in an empty room, thinking about his kids, about 2 broken marriages, and he felt his heart was no longer as hard as it was in the Lombardi days. It was softer, more vulnerable, and far lonelier. That loneliness wasn't loud, it wasn't crying or sighing, it was the long silence between breaths. The faraway look when someone asked about family. The feeling of being out of place at gatherings when others showed pictures of their kids and he showed his book. In those moments, Jerry understood he could be the toughest man in the NFL, but as a husband and father, he was as fragile as anyone. And then, as fate often does with people who have suffered too much, it gave him a third chance not to fix the past, but to build a future. Jerry found love again. A love that didn't arrive in glory, didn't come when he was a Packers hero, but came when he was old, slow, weak, and bitter enough to finally understand that family isn't one with strength. It's one with the gentleness he had never been taught. And the miracle happened for the first time in his life. Jerry learned to say "I love you." For the first time he allowed himself to be weak in front of someone else. For the first time he understood that love is not a battlefield. But the most beautiful and most painful part was that Jerry became the father he always wanted to be. Not perfect, not strong, but real. And even though the fear of illness always hovered, even though his body hurt every day, Jerry still tried to read to his kids even when his eyes were blurry, tried to stand up from the chair to hug them even when his back locked up, tried to smile even when his heart wanted to collapse. Family didn't heal all of Jerry's wounds, but it gave him a place to set those wounds down. And right there, where there were no cheers, no Lombardi, no ice bowl, Jerry Kramer found something a lifetime chasing glory could never give him: the small, simple, priceless joy of a man who finally understood love. But even when family gave Jerry a rare sliver of peace, fate still refused to let him go. Because beyond the physical pain and the broken relationships, Jerry still had to face a deeper, longer-lasting, crueler wound than any surgery: the NFL's forgetting. A forgetting that lasted 40 years. After instant replay became a phenomenon, Jerry believed, and everyone believed, that he would soon be inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, not because he wrote a book, but because on the field he was one of the greatest guards the NFL ever saw. The Ice Bowl was living proof: 2 All-Pro selections, 5 championships. The heart of the Packers suite, the play that changed football. But the first year he was eligible, the Hall didn't call his name. Jerry wasn't too bothered. Maybe next year, he told himself. Second year, nothing. Third year, silence. Fourth, fifth, sixth, 10 years passed. Jerry was still outside the door. But the tragedy didn't stop there. Because while Jerry was being forgotten, one by one the players from the legendary Lombardi Packers were called to the stage. Bart Starr, in Forrest Gregg, in Paul Hornung, in Ray Nitschke, in Herb Adderley, in Jim Taylor, in Willie Wood, in Henry Jordan, in one by one, name by name. Every member of his Packers family honored in front of thousands on national television to thunderous applause. Only Jerry, the man who opened lanes for them, who bled so they could score, who made the block in 45 degrees Fahrenheit hell, remained outside the light. He still clapped, still smiled, still hugged them when they received their gold jackets, still posed for congratulatory photos, but every hug carried a knife. A few teammates pulled him aside and said, "Jerry, you should have gone in before me." But those words didn't open the door. They only made Jerry feel abandoned in the very story he had helped write. Then the 1980s came, then the 1990s. Hall of Fame voters changed. A new generation arrived, people who never saw Jerry play, who only knew him from old clips, and to them guards weren't important. That Packers team had too many legends. Jerry was seen as not essential. Every time his name wasn't called, Jerry smiled for the public. But when he got home and closed the door, the smile vanished. Years later he admitted, "I felt ashamed, like I hadn't been good enough." The words "not enough," Jerry's lifelong curse, came back to haunt him. It was like a ghost that had followed him from Idaho, through the NFL, and now stood in front of the Hall of Fame door whispering, "You're still not good enough." But the cruelest tragedy wasn't the rejection, it was waiting so long that he had to watch what every player fears most, his teammates dying, before he could be honored beside them. Henry Jordan died, Willie Davis died, Forrest Gregg died, Jim Taylor died, Willie Wood died. The men who fought beside him, who walked into Lambeau in the freezing cold, who shared the pain and the joy, left one by one without ever standing on the hall stage with Jerry. At every funeral, Jerry bowed his head, placed a hand on the casket, and whispered goodbye, but inside was torment. They went into the hall while alive, he did not. It felt as if history had cruelly, coldly, senselessly separated him from his own family. At Willie Wood's memorial, a reporter asked the familiar question, "Do you think the hall will call your name this year?" Jerry just gave a tired smile, the weary smile of a man rejected so many times the pain had gone numb. Over 40 years he was denied 10 times. Every denial twisted his heart, not because he needed the honor, but because he needed fairness. Fairness for the years he fought with body and soul. Fairness for 23 surgeries. Fairness for the sacrifice in the ice bowl. Fairness for the nights he lay in bed, stomach pain nearly killing him, yet still showed up to practice because Lombardi said, "I need you." He didn't ask for much. He only wanted to stand beside the brothers he had helped build the Packers' empire with. But for 40 years he stood outside that door, watching others walk through, watching them cheered, watching them enter eternity, while he remained in the land of the forgotten, with the Idaho wind blowing through decades of waiting. Some evenings Jerry sat alone in his living room, staring at the wall covered with photos of the Lombardi teams, smiling faces, golden moments, immortal memories. But the longer he looked, the more he realized one heartbreaking truth: of all those faces, he was the only one the hall had not recognized. That feeling was like standing in a huge family, while everyone else's name is called at graduation, and his is skipped. That hurt never went away. It lived in his bones, in his blood, in the scars that healed on the outside, but never healed inside his heart. And as if time wanted to test him to the absolute limit, it stretched that weight into an unimaginable number: 40 years. 40 years. A lifetime. 40 years. Enough for a young man to become an old one. 40 years. Enough for loved ones to leave this world. 40 years. Far too long to call it a delay. It is tragedy. And at the center of that tragedy stood a man who once opened the legendary lane in the ice bowl, yet could not open the Hall of Fame door for himself. But then, after 4 decades of waiting, justice finally knocked. And when it did, the moment was so beautiful, it brought all of America to tears. 40 years quietly standing outside the Hall of Fame door. 40 years watching his teammates honored. 40 years hearing the names of the men he fought beside called to the gold stage, then going home with a heavy heart. Those 40 years felt like an endless punishment, as if history wanted to test how much forgetting one man could endure before he broke. But Jerry did not break. He only grew old in waiting, grew old believing fairness might never come, grew old in the emptiness as teammate after teammate left the earth, taking with them the chance to stand beside him in glory. And then in 2018, when Jerry was 82 years old, when his hands shook from age and old wounds, when his eyes had dimmed after decades of pain, when his hair was white as an Idaho winter, the phone call he had waited a lifetime for finally came. That morning Jerry was sitting in his living room, staring at the 1967 Packers team photo, the same picture he had looked at thousands of times over 40 years. When the phone rang, he thought nothing of it. But when the voice on the other end said, "Jerry, congratulations, you're going to Canton," the whole world around him stopped. He was silent, completely silent. Then his hands began to shake, his shoulders trembled slightly, his eyes blurred before he could even process what was happening. The man who blocked Jethro Pugh in 45 degrees Fahrenheit, the man who survived 23 surgeries, and still came back to the field, the man who stared death down in operating rooms, was crying, not loud tears, but the kind that fall after 40 years of being held back, heavy, slow, deep. When he was called to the Super Bowl stage to officially announce the Hall of Fame class of 2018, Jerry walked out under the lights with a slight limp. His hands shook lightly holding the microphone. His eyes were red. Tens of thousands in the stadium rose to applaud, and millions watched on TV. But Jerry didn't see the spotlight. He only saw the faces that were gone. Lombardi, Gregg, Wood, Nitschke, Jordan, Taylor, the men he wished could be standing beside him in this moment. When he spoke, his voice broke. "I've waited for this moment, my whole life." The stadium fell dead silent. That sentence wasn't a thank you. It wasn't a pretty line for points. It was the confession of a soul that had endured too much, waited too long, walked through a loneliness only those forgotten by history can understand. In Canton, when the cloth was pulled from his bronze bust, Jerry reached out with trembling fingers and touched it. In that moment he cried again. But those weren't tears of pure joy. They were the tears of a warrior finally recognized. Long after the war was over, a reporter asked him, "Do you have any regrets? Wish this had come sooner?" Jerry gave a sad smile. "I only wish Lombardi were still alive to see today." That sentence silenced America, not because of Lombardi's name, but because of the brutal truth behind it. Justice had come, but it came too late to bring Lombardi back, too late to bring back the teammates who died so they could stand together on that stage, too late to give back the years Jerry carried shame, bitterness and heartbreak, too late to erase the nights he lay alone in the dark, wondering why he wasn't good enough, too late to make up for the 40 years he stood outside the door of glory, while others walked in. Some people say, as long as he got in, whenever is fine. But anyone who truly understands Jerry, understands his life, the weight he carried, knows the truth isn't that simple. Some victories don't arrive to bring joy, they arrive to close a wound that stayed open far too long. In his Hall of Fame speech, Jerry ended with a line that choked the entire hall. "Thank you for not forgetting me." That was all. That was what he needed most. Not the title, not the money, not the bronze bust, just the reminder that he existed. That the pain he endured wasn't meaningless, that the block in the ice bowl wasn't just a moment that drifted into the past. Many saw Jerry smiling at the ceremony, but they didn't see his heart melting between pride and sorrow, because he knew, if this had come in 1970, 1980, or 1990, he would have stood among the people he loved most. But now he stood only among their memories. Jerry's tears in Canton that year weren't tears of triumph. They were the heavy tears of a late goodbye, of recognition that arrived in old age, when teammates were gone, when his soul was weary, when the greatest fight of his life, the fight against being forgotten, finally ended, but so late that a warrior's heart could only whisper, "Thank you for finally seeing me." At age 89, when the stadium lights had long gone dark, when the roar of Lambeau Field echoed only in memory, the greatest battle of Jerry Kramer's life was no longer on the field. It was inside his own crumbling body and mind. If the Ice Bowl was the coldest game in NFL history, old age was the coldest game of his life. A cold that didn't come from weather, but from time. The body that was once a war machine was now falling apart piece by piece. Arthritis tormented his fingers so badly he could barely hold a coffee cup. Knees that once absorbed thousands of collisions swelled painfully every morning. His back curved, every step a challenge. His eyesight faded so much that sometimes he had to squint hard to recognize his own face in the mirror. Doctors said what Jerry was experiencing was the inevitable price of a lifetime of collisions, surgeries, and sacrifice. But Jerry only gave a faint, sad smile. The smile of a man who understood the bill had been written the moment he stepped into the NFL, and the mental pain. It came quietly, slowly, but no less cruelly. In his Idaho home, once filled with the laughter of children and grandchildren, only heavy silence remained. On the walls hung framed photos. Bart Starr smiling in number 15. Forrest Gregg standing tall like a statue. Lombardi with his steely gaze. Willie Wood, Henry Jordan, Jim Taylor, all looking at him from old pictures, faces now living only in memory. Every morning as he walked the hallway, Jerry touched each frame as if touching souls long gone. And sometimes in the pale afternoon light, he felt left behind. Left behind in a world where the people he loved most no longer existed. Left behind among memories frozen like ice. left behind as the last survivor of a tribe that no longer existed. When a reporter asked how he felt at 89, Jerry sighed for a very long time, then said a sentence that silenced everyone: "I think about death more than ever." Not because he feared dying. He had faced death at 15 when the wood went through his stomach, faced it in every operating room, smelled its breath in the ice bowl. But in old age, death took a different shape, no longer a fierce enemy in front of him, but a quiet shadow approaching from behind. Some mornings Jerry woke up, looked at his trembling hands and wondered, will my memory still be whole today? Because time doesn't just take muscle, it takes memories. It takes pieces of a life, slowly, cruelly, without warning. Some days Jerry could tell the ice bowl story, like it happened yesterday. Other days he'd stop mid-sentence, trying to recall a teammate's name, only to realize that man had been dead for over 20 years. Little gaps in memory started appearing, small, but enough to scare him. Scared that one day he would wake up and not remember the ice bowl, not remember the Packers' sweep, not remember Lombardi, not remember the brothers he loved most, and worst of all, not remember who he once was. At 89, Jerry had to face the hardest truth of his life. A warrior can defeat the strongest opponent, but he cannot defeat time. His whole life Jerry lived on strength. Strength of muscle, strength of will, strength of endurance. But old age isn't a battle you can block with your shoulder. It isn't a game you can win with determination. It isn't an opponent you can beat with Packers spirit. Old age has only one strategy: acceptance. But acceptance was never something Jerry was good at. Some nights he lay in bed listening to the fireplace crackle and felt emptiness flood in like cold water. He remembered Bart, remembered Greg, remembered Willie Wood, remembered Lombardi, the man who screamed in his face but believed in him more than anyone. He remembered freezing practices, remembered running the sweep until collapse, remembered the feeling of his shoulder popping when he hit a 270-pound defensive tackle, remembered the roar of Lambeau Field, like the voice of God. Then he looked around the empty room and understood that all of it now lived only inside him. No one else was still alive to tell the stories with him. That is a loneliness unlike any other, not the loneliness of a man with no one beside him, but the loneliness of the last person alive carrying the memories of an entire generation, a burden no one else can share. And then Jerry admitted the thing he had kept inside his whole life. I'm not afraid of dying, I'm only afraid of being forgotten. That wasn't weakness, it was the truth of a man who spent his entire life fighting against invisibility. A man once dismissed, a man almost cut by the Packers. A man left outside the Hall of Fame for 4 decades. He won every battle, except the battle with time. At 89, every passing day was a reminder that his body was crumbling. Every photo on the wall was a reminder that the people he loved were gone. Every quiet afternoon was a reminder that he was at the end of the journey. And through all of it, Jerry Kramer still stood, back bent, steps slow, eyes dim, but his heart had never surrendered. Because even if old age took his strength, it could not take who he was, a Packers warrior, a man who traded everything for his team, his teammates, his dream. And now, in the final battle against time, he didn't need victory, he only needed to be remembered. At 89, when time had blurred the eyes that once read every movement on the field, when the body that was once the Packers' steel wall had softened with pain, one truth still stood above everything. Jerry Kramer's life was not perfect, but it was great in a way few dare to live. And it was in that imperfection, in the scars, the failures, the rejections, the lonely moments, that his legacy became deeper than any trophy the NFL could give. Because if Jerry's life had only been victories, he would be like every other legend. But his life was pain turned into legacy, a living lesson in resilience, the ability to rise above adversity, the quality that forms the soul of America. Look back at his journey, from a poor Idaho farm boy working in skin-cutting winters, growing up in the silence of praise that never came, to a college player dismissed, hearing his coach say he would never be strong enough, to an NFL rookie nearly cut, enduring screams and humiliation that almost sent him back to the farm, to a Packers warrior, forged by Lombardi with pain, discipline, and a belief no one else saw, to 23 surgeries, each one opening his stomach a step away from death, to the ice bowl, where he blocked with everything left in a body tearing itself apart from pain, to 40 years forgotten, standing outside the Hall of Fame, watching teammates honored and then die without ever sharing the stage, to the moment in 2018, when a white-haired, stooped, trembling old man finally heard the words he had waited a lifetime for. "Congratulations, Jerry, justice is here." And to the final battle, facing old age, fading memory, no friends left, only himself. A life like that, with dazzling peaks and pitch-black valleys, cannot be called perfect, but it is great. Greater than any championship season, greater than any Super Bowl ring, great because it shows how many times a person can fall and still get up. Jerry Kramer is not a legend because of one block in the ice bowl, not because of 5 championships, not because of instant replay. He became a legend because he persevered, because he refused to quit when the world said he couldn't, because he got up when his body wanted to stay down, because he believed in himself when the NFL no longer did, because he kept his dignity through 40 years of being forgotten. And that is what makes him a symbol not just of the Packers, not just of the NFL, but of the American spirit. The spirit of ordinary people who never kneel to adversity. Today, when Jerry sits in his quiet house surrounded by photos of those who are gone, he understands that true legacy isn't in muscle, victories, or awards. It's in the things no one saw, the nights he lay in pain unable to sleep yet, still showed up to practice the next morning, the games he played on wounds that never healed, the moments he felt invisible yet kept walking forward, the times the Hall of Fame rejected him yet he still smiled. The NFL may never say it out loud, but the truth is clear. No guard in history endured more pain than Jerry Kramer. No guard waited longer for recognition. No guard turned life's cruelty into strength like he did. That is why America must remember him. Remember, not just for his career, not just for the Ice Bowl, not just for the bronze bust in Canton. Remember because his life proves that glory is temporary.
Whoa.
But character, survival, resilience, courage, is immortal. So what does America learn from the journey of a man who started on an Idaho farm? That sometimes justice comes late, but when it does, it affirms the power of human perseverance. That success is not measured by how fast you reach it, but by the strength it takes to rise after every fall. That a person's worth is not in the spotlight, but in the sacrifices the world never sees. That greatness is not never failing, but never letting failure break you. That the quiet heroes, the guards, the workers, the ones who never stand center stage, are the ones who truly build America's foundation. Jerry Kramer is one of them, a quiet hero, a warrior forged in ice, tested by pain, lifted by will, and defined not by circumstance, but by how he rose above it. And now, as he takes slow steps through a house full of memories, Jerry no longer has to search for recognition. He has it, not just in the Hall of Fame, but in the hearts of those who understand his life as a song of endurance, not a song of victory, but a song of the ability to hurt, to rise, to never quit. That is his legacy. And America, the country that always admires those who overcome, has a duty to remember. It is not those who wear the spotlight who are the greatest. It is those who suffer the most to keep that light from going out. Jerry Kramer is one of those people, and his legacy will live longer than his wounds, longer than time, longer than his own life. Looking back at Jerry Kramer's journey, we don't just see a football player, we see a symbol of America, a man who walked through pain, forgetting and even death to prove his worth. Sadly, his life was not a flawless hero's tale of constant triumph, but a long chain of scars stretching from the wood through his stomach at age 15 to 23, blood-soaked surgeries throughout his career. Those details, especially holding in agony to make the block in the ice bowl at 45 degrees Fahrenheit, or nearly collapsing from stomach pain right before the game, reveal the sacrifice the crowd never saw under the stadium lights. But what haunts and hurts the most is the 40 years the Hall of Fame forgot him. 40 years standing outside the door, watching teammates honored and then die. while he, the heart of the Packers sweep, was left behind. When at age 82 he said, "I've waited for this moment my whole life," it wasn't joy, it was the sigh of a soul finally seen. And from Jerry's life, the people of the United States can draw a profound lesson. Glory is not in how quickly you are recognized, but in the ability to stand tall despite rejection after rejection. True strength doesn't come from muscle, it comes from resilience, from dignity held firm even when no one stands with you. Jerry Kramer reminds America that the greatest heroes are sometimes not the ones cheered first, but the ones who endure the longest until the light finally finds them. If the story of the perseverance and sacrifice of legend Jerry Kramer touched you, please hit subscribe to keep walking with us as we explore the people who built the soul of America. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we continue honoring the quiet heroes that time is never allowed to forget.